The black boy gave up his seat to a pregnant woman on the crowded bus, without expecting anything in return. But the next day, a luxurious car stopped in front of his house, and he froze when he saw who was stepping out. The afternoon sun beat down on the busy streets of Chicago as Jordan straightened his heavy backpack on his thin shoulders. His school uniform, with faded stains and a small tear in the sleeve, showed constant use without replacement. Executives in suits and people in a hurry bumped into him as if they didn't even notice the 13-year-old black boy trying to make his way through the crowd. Cars honked impatiently in the traffic. Jordan dodged puddles of water on the broken sidewalk, protecting his only school shoes. The smell of food coming from the restaurants made his stomach rumble. He had saved his lunch money to help with the month's shopping. She passed the window of an electronics store, where TVs showed advertisements of happy families having dinner together. His reflection in the glass showed a boy alone, carrying a backpack almost bigger than himself. The books weighed so much that his back ached, but Jordan knew that studying was his only chance of changing his life. After 40 minutes of walking, he finally reached the building where he lived, an old brick building with a rusty fire escape on the side. He climbed the 4 floors on foot, as the elevator had been broken for months. His hands trembled a little as he turned the key in the lock of apartment 402. The cramped 2-room space welcomed him with familiar silence. On the small kitchen table, he found 2 notes written in his mother's hurried handwriting. "There's rice and beans in the fridge. Heat it up for you. Do the dishes and mop the floor. I love you." On the second piece of paper, "Son, don't forget to collect the clothes from the clothesline before you go to bed. I'll be back after midnight. Love from Mom." He left his backpack on the floor and looked out of the narrow window. The sky was beginning to darken over Chicago, and another night alone awaited him. Jordan held the crumpled notes in his hands, feeling the weight of the words beyond the simple instructions. He opened the fridge and found the lunchbox of rice and beans, the same food as the last 3 days. The silent apartment echoed with the sound of his footsteps as he heated up the food in the old microwave. On the kitchen table, piles of bills accumulated under a makeshift paperweight. An electricity bill with a red notice, prenatal insurance bill, last month's unpaid rent. Jordan picked up one of the envelopes, his hands trembling as he saw the numbers too big for his mother's salary. As he ate straight from his lunchbox so as not to dirty any more plates, he looked at the faded photo on the wall. Him and his mother smiling in front of the building 3 years ago when they first moved in, before the pregnancy, before the health complications, before she needed her second job. The clock struck 1943. Her mother was on the cafeteria shift now, her pregnancy-swollen feet pressed against the floor for hours on end. The doctor had warned them about the risks, but they had no choice. The shrill ring of the landline phone cut through the silence. Jordan rushed to answer it, recognizing the number of the diner. "Son?" His mother's tired voice was barely audible over the din of fryers and shouts of orders in the background. "Sarah didn't come in today. I'll have to cover her shift until closing." "But Mom, the doctor said—" "I know, my love." She sighed deeply. "But that's $200 more at the end of the month. I've left a packet of cookies in the top drawer if you get hungry later. Lock the door and don't forget the clothesline." The phone went silent before Jordan could protest. He looked down at his belly, half full of rice and beans, his appetite disappearing as he thought of his 7 months pregnant mother serving hamburgers until the early hours of the morning. Jordan carefully put the phone on the hook, as if the sudden movement might hurt his mother on the other end of the line. His eyes fixed on the recent photo hanging crookedly on the wall, his mother 5 months pregnant, the cafeteria uniform stretched over her growing belly, a forced smile on her tired face. He remembered his last doctor's appointment when he accompanied his mother in hiding, skipping school. The doctor talking about high blood pressure, the risk of preeclampsia, the urgent need for rest. His mother just nodding, knowing that rest didn't pay the bills. Jordan felt his stomach turn as he remembered her fainting in the kitchen last week after coming home from her first shift. The sound of the old fridge humming filled the silence as he grabbed the ingredients to make a sandwich. His mother would need something to eat when she arrived. The doctor's words echoed in his head. "Your pregnancy is high risk. You need to reduce your workload immediately." She separated the few ingredients available: bread rolls, margarine, a slice of ham she had saved from her school lunch. His hands trembled as he prepared the sandwich, thinking of his little brother in his mother's belly. Could he feel her tiredness too? Did he know that his mother worked 16 hours a day to ensure his arrival? He covered his plate with a napkin and left it on the table. She switched on the only lamp in the room, creating a small circle of yellowish light. It was after 10 at night, but Jordan pulled his books out of his backpack and settled down at the kitchen table. He would study right there, waiting for the familiar sound of keys in the lock. His mother shouldn't be back alone so late. Jordan slowly chewed the rest of his cold rice, his eyes fixed on the empty place at the table where his father used to sit. 3 years since he left to buy cigarettes and never came back. The memory was blurred now, a broad smile, a hoarse laugh, the smell of car oil on his work shirts. And then nothing, not a message, not a phone call, not an explanation. The fork scraped against the bottom of the plastic lunchbox. Her mother never complained about being abandoned, but Jordan heard her crying quietly some nights. The crying became more frequent after she found out she was pregnant, the result of a brief relationship with a man who also disappeared when he found out about the baby. Jordan clenched his fists tightly, feeling the familiar anger rise in his throat. Now, he was the man of the house. He had to be strong, he had to help, he had to protect his mother and the brother who was coming. The dirty dishes in the sink reminded him of the chores he still had to do. He couldn't be weak, he couldn't be a bother, he couldn't be another burden for his mother to carry. The digital clock on the microwave flashed 23:47 when the metallic sound of keys echoed through the door. Jordan ran to help. His mother staggered in, one hand resting on her protruding belly, the other clutching her worn handbag. Her cafeteria uniform was smeared with grease, her feet so swollen they barely fit into her shoes. Her eyes were red with fatigue, but she still tried to smile when she saw her son. "My love, still awake? You have school tomorrow." Jordan rushed over to hold his mother's heavy bag, gently guiding her to the only upholstered chair in the apartment. She took a deep breath, a grimace of pain crossing her face as she sat down. Without saying anything, he brought her the sandwich he had prepared, along with a glass of water and her blood pressure medicine. "Did you make this for me?" Her voice came out hoarse with fatigue. Jordan just nodded, busying himself with removing the tight shoes from her swollen feet. The silence between them carried years of understanding. Every gesture, every look conveyed what words could not. He watched his mother eat slowly, noticing how she disguised her heartburn faces, how her free hand unconsciously caressed her belly. The baby must have been restless, as he always was at night. Jordan filled the glass with water again when she coughed, choking in her haste to finish the sandwich. "I need to show you something," she murmured, avoiding his gaze as she reached for her bag. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pulled out a crumpled envelope. It arrived today from the hospital. Jordan recognized the medical center's letterhead before his mother even opened the envelope. Another bill, more numbers that didn't fit into the tight budget. The paper trembled in her hands as her tired eyes scanned the figures, a solitary tear running down her cheek. Jordan felt his heart squeeze as he watched his mother blink repeatedly, trying to focus on the numbers blurred by fatigue. Her fingers moved in the air, making invisible calculations: the cleaning salary, the tips from the cafeteria, the rent arrears, the basic bills. $475 for the last ultrasound and blood tests. Money that didn't exist. "Maybe I can pick up a few more shifts on the weekends," she muttered, more to herself than to Jordan. Her voice trembled along with the hands that held the bill. "If I work overtime every day for 2 weeks." Jordan swallowed dryly, remembering her recent fainting spell, the doctor's recommendations she'd ignored, her high blood pressure only getting worse. His mother was already working beyond her limits. He thought of the money stashed in a cookie tin, his savings to buy a new pair of sneakers. $32, a ridiculous amount next to what they needed. "Mom, you need to rest," he whispered, gently taking the bill from her hands. "We'll sort it out tomorrow." She tried to protest, but her tiredness was stronger. Her eyes began to close as she tried to organize the papers. Jordan watched as her breathing slowed, her body relaxing against the worn sofa. Her crumpled uniform still smelled of frying, her 7-month belly rising and falling in rhythm with her sleep. Careful not to wake her, Jordan took the thin blanket from the bedroom, the only one they had. He gently covered his mother, placing a pillow under her head. In the darkness of the room, the paper medical bill seemed to glow on the table, like a cruel reminder of the reality that awaited them in the morning. The alarm clock went off at 5:30 a.m., but Jordan was already awake. He found his mother in the small kitchen, swallowing a black coffee quickly, her cleaning uniform already on. She had deep circles under her eyes, her hair barely tied back in a hasty bun. The doctor's bill from the night before was still on the table, now with a few notes in the margins. "Have you taken your medicine?" Jordan asked, separating 2 slices of bread for her. Her mother nodded distractedly, checking the time on the wall clock every few seconds. The 6:15 bus wasn't waiting for anyone, and she still had to walk 4 blocks to the stop. "Do you have money for your snack?" she asked, running her hands over her crumpled uniform. Jordan lied, knowing that she hadn't changed since yesterday. The baby stirred visibly in her belly, making her take a deep breath and lean on the sink. "Mom, aren't you going to eat the bread?" "There's no time, son. If I miss this bus..." She picked up her worn-out bag, checking the bus passes inside. "There's food ready in the fridge for you. Don't forget to lock the door." Jordan watched helplessly as she put on her worn-out shoes, her belly making it difficult to move. He wanted to tell her so many things. To get more rest, not to worry about money, that he would manage. But the words stuck in his throat. From the apartment window, she saw her mother hurrying across the street, one hand resting on her stomach. She paused for a moment, taking a deep breath, before continuing her walk towards the bus stop. Jordan finished getting ready for school, her heart squeezing as she watched her pregnant mother walk away, carrying the weight of the world on her back. Mathematical equations mingled with calculations of overdue bills in Jordan's mind. Even so, his hand quickly jotted down the answers. Numbers were his forte, perhaps because he spent so much time adding up pennies at home. The teacher smiled as she passed his desk, marking another success in his notebook. In literature class, he was able to quote passages from the book he had borrowed from the library from memory. It was his only form of entertainment on nights alone. His classmates talked about video games and TV shows he had never seen, so Jordan immersed himself in books, temporarily escaping reality. A stomach growl distracted him during science class. He hadn't eaten anything since breakfast. The snack money had been saved to help with the bills. He forced himself to pay attention to the explanation of the circulatory system, but his mind kept returning to the image of his mother walking with difficulty to the bus stop. When the teacher mentioned high-risk pregnancy during the lesson, Jordan felt the pencil shake in his hand. He wrote down every word about pregnancy complications, his normally neat handwriting now rushed and crooked. He needed to better understand what was happening to his mother. The shrill signal cut off his thoughts. Jordan quickly put the material away in his battered backpack, mentally calculating if he ran, he'd catch the 15:20 bus. He needed to be home before 4 to collect the laundry from the clothesline before the rain that threatened to fall. His worn-out sneakers banged against the floor as he ran down the corridor, clutching his heavy backpack to his chest. The bus rattled through the streets of Chicago as Jordan settled into the hard seat by the window. His back ached from the weight of the backpack, and hunger clawed at his empty stomach. He leaned his forehead against the foggy glass, watching the gray city pass by quickly, shiny corporate buildings mingling with the decaying buildings of his neighborhood. His eyes were heavy with fatigue. He had slept little the past few nights, preoccupied by his mother's moans of pain in the next room. The rocking of the bus almost put him to sleep, but Jordan forced himself to stay alert. He couldn't miss his stop. The heavy rush-hour traffic brought the bus to a halt at every corner. People crowded into the aisle, holding on as tightly as they could to the support bars. The air inside the vehicle became heavier and heavier, mixing sweat with cheap perfume and exhaust. At a busy point in the shopping district, the bus came to an abrupt halt. The doors opened with a squeak, and Jordan saw a pregnant woman trying to climb the steep steps. She was wearing an elegant office outfit, but her face was tense with discomfort. Her belly, similar in size to her mother's, hindered her movements as she tried to balance herself with an executive briefcase in one hand. Jordan's heart squeezed at the sight of the pregnant woman trying to keep her balance, one hand resting on her belly as the bus pulled away. His fingers gripped the edge of the seat, recognizing in her expression of discomfort the same grimaces his mother made when she got home after hours on her feet. Jordan's tired body was begging him to sit down. He still had to collect the clothes from the clothesline, do his homework, and prepare something to eat. His muscles ached from the weight of his backpack, and his empty stomach protested. For a moment, she pretended not to see, staring at the foggy window. The woman held on tightly as the bus braked abruptly. Her briefcase almost fell out, and she closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. She was the same size as her mother, her round belly stretching the thin fabric of her dress. But while her mother wore a grease-stained uniform, this lady wore expensive clothes and designer shoes. The image of his mother staggering to the bus stop that morning flashed through his mind. Jordan felt ashamed of his hesitation. Without further thought, he stood up in one swift movement, picking up his heavy backpack. "Mom," his voice came out lower than he had intended. "You can sit here." The woman looked at him, surprised by the unexpected gesture. Her eyes roamed over Jordan's worn-out school uniform, his worn-out sneakers, his patched backpack. For a moment, she seemed to hesitate, as if she couldn't believe the offer. "Thank you very much, dear." Mrs. Thompson's voice was soft, genuinely grateful as she settled into her seat. Jordan gripped the metal bar above, trying to keep his balance with the heavy backpack. "What's your name?" Jordan hesitated, his mother's words about not talking to strangers echoing in his mind. But there was something in the lady's gentle smile, in the way she unconsciously smoothed her belly, that reminded him of his own mother. "Jordan, ma'am," he answered quietly, almost swallowed up by the noise of the engine. "Do you study nearby, Jordan?" She settled her briefcase on her lap, her attentive eyes showing real interest. The bus rattled under braking, and Jordan staggered slightly. "Lincoln High," he answered, holding on tighter. A bead of sweat trickled down his forehead. The broken air conditioning made the atmosphere stifling. "It's a good school. It must be tiring to make that journey every day." She noticed the sweat stains on his uniform, the way he leaned on one foot and then the other. Something in the genuine concern in his voice broke through Jordan's barriers. Maybe it was tiredness, maybe it was the resemblance to his mother, or just the need to share the weight he was carrying. "It is, but..." He swallowed, the words escaping before he could contain them. "My mother makes much longer journeys. She's also pregnant, like you." "Your mother is pregnant too." Mrs. Thompson shifted in her seat, her face showing genuine interest. "How many months?" "7. Jordan replied, surprising himself with his desire to keep talking. "Just like you, I guess." The bus stopped at a red light, and he saw the lady's expression change when he mentioned his mother's 2 jobs. Her eyebrows drew together in concern when she heard about the double shifts, the shifts at the cafeteria, the complications of pregnancy. "What time does she work at the cafeteria?" Mrs. Thompson's voice had a different tone now, more tense. "Sometimes until after midnight." Jordan felt his throat tighten. "Yesterday she worked overtime again, even though the doctor said she had high blood pressure." The lady opened her executive briefcase, looking for something urgent. Jordan watched, confused, as she took out a business card and an expensive pen. "What's your address, Jordan?" she asked, pen already poised over the paper. Seeing his hesitation, she added gently, "I promise it's for a good reason." Jordan felt his stomach churn with nervousness. His instincts told him not to share personal information, but something in the lady's determined gaze made him reconsider. In a shaky voice, he dictated the address of the apartment, watching her write down every detail on the back of the card. "Please, Ma'am," he began, uncertain. "I don't want to cause any trouble." Jordan got off the bus 3 stops later, his hands shaking as he gripped the straps of his backpack. With every step towards home, the weight of what he had done seemed to increase. The card with his address was now in that lady's expensive briefcase, a complete stranger. What could she do with that information? What if she was from social services? The fear of being separated from his mother made his stomach turn. The familiar streets of his neighborhood seemed different now, threatening. He remembered the stories his mother used to tell him about people who took advantage of families in difficulty. He had been naive, taken in by the apparent kindness and the resemblance to his mother. Damn it! Why had he talked so much? Why hadn't he made up a false address? He ran up the stairs, his legs shaking not only from the physical effort. What if the lady turned up? What if she denounced her mother for working too much during her pregnancy? Social services could even take away the baby, who hadn't even been born yet. The key turned in the lock with a familiar click. The small apartment had never seemed as safe as it did at that moment. Jordan leaned against the closed door, taking a deep breath. No, he couldn't tell his mother. She had enough to worry about. She didn't need to carry that weight any longer. He looked at his watch. He still had time to collect the clothes from the clothesline and do his homework before she arrived. The more normal the routine, the better. With any luck, the lady on the bus would forget her address, and that meeting would be just another story to forget. Jordan was mopping the kitchen floor when he heard excited voices in the hallway. Donna Maria from 302 was talking loudly about a black car parked in front of the building, something unusual in that neighborhood of old cars and crowded buses. Jordan's heart raced. He dropped the wet floor cloth and ran to the living room window, leaving damp footprints on the floor. His fingers trembled as he pulled aside the thin curtain, just enough to peek underneath. The black Audi glistened in the afternoon sun, standing out from the deteriorated streets of the neighborhood. A few neighborhood kids were already crowding around it, admiring the vehicle that seemed to have come from another world. "He must be a politician or a drug dealer," he heard Mr. Jose from the first floor say to someone. "People like that don't stop here for nothing." Jordan felt his blood run cold when the driver's door opened. A tall man in a dark blue suit got out first, straightening his expensive tie. Then he walked around the car and opened the passenger door, holding out his hand to help someone out. The world seemed to stop when Jordan recognized the elegant ensemble and the pregnant belly. Mrs. Thompson looked up at the building, her expensive shoes deftly avoiding the puddles on the broken sidewalk. She held an executive briefcase, the same as yesterday. Jordan backed away from the window, his heart beating so hard he could hear it in his ears. He stumbled over the bucket of water, spilling some on the already clean floor. His hands were shaking as he tried to dry the mess quickly with the cloth. The neighbors' comments in the hallway grew louder. "They're coming up!" "They asked for 402. His apartment number echoed like a sentence. Jordan ran his eyes over the small space, the clothes laid out on the makeshift clothesline in the living room, the coffee dishes still in the sink, his books scattered on the table, footsteps on the stairs. The sound grew closer by the second. Jordan stood paralyzed in the middle of the room, the wet cloth still in his hand. Should he pretend he wasn't home? But they had probably already heard the sound of the bucket falling. Should he call his mother? No, she was at work. She couldn't worry now. The corridor was suddenly silent. They had reached the 4th floor. Jordan held his breath. Soft footsteps approached his door, followed by a soft knock. "Jordan?" Mrs. Thompson's voice was as gentle as it had been on the bus. "It's me, the lady from yesterday's bus. Can we talk for a minute?" Jordan took a deep breath and straightened his crumpled uniform before opening the door. The Thompson couple looked even more imposing in the narrow corridor of their building. Mr. Thompson's suit probably cost more than all the furniture in the apartment put together. Mrs. Thompson smiled kindly, but her eyes roamed worriedly over the peeling walls and exposed wiring in the hallway. "Hi, Mom." Jordan kept one hand on the door, his body partially blocking the entrance. He tried to look older, more responsible, even though his legs were shaking. "My mom's not home right now." "I imagine not." Mrs. Thompson exchanged a look with her husband. "She's probably working, isn't she? As you told us yesterday." Mr. Thompson stepped forward, his formal posture softening a little. "Jordan, we'd really like to talk to your mother. Could we come in and wait for her? I promise it's something important and good." Jordan studied both their faces, years of early responsibility having taught him to judge people's intentions. There was genuine concern in Mrs. Thompson's eyes, and something in Mr. Thompson's manner reminded him of teachers who really cared about their students. "She'll be here in an hour," Jordan finally said, opening the door wider. "You can come in, but—" He straightened his shoulders, trying to sound firm. "Please don't do anything to hurt my mother." Jordan took the only 2 clean glasses he had in the kitchen and filled them with water from the tap. His hands trembled slightly as he served the couple, who were settling down on the small, worn sofa. Mrs. Thompson thanked them with a kind smile, while Mr. Thompson looked at the picture on the wall, Jordan and his mother smiling. "Do you like studying, Jordan?" Mr. Thompson asked, noticing the school books on the table. His tone was casual, as if they were on a normal Sunday visit. "Yes, sir," Jordan replied, taking a seat in the only available chair. "Math is my favorite subject." Mrs. Thompson leaned over a little, one hand resting on her stomach. "Sarah tells me you're very polite. That gesture on the bus." She paused, moved. "It's not every day that we see young people so attentive." Jordan relaxed a little, but his eyes remained fixed on his watch. The ticking seemed louder than usual, filling the silences in the conversation. It was 15 minutes before his mother arrived home from her first job. The familiar sound of footsteps echoed up the stairs. Jordan immediately recognized the slow, tired rhythm, the soft drag of worn shoes on the floor. His heart raced. His mother had arrived early. The door opened, and Jordan's mother walked in, still straightening her crumpled uniform. She stopped abruptly at the sight of the elegant couple on their sofa, one hand instinctively resting on their protruding bellies, the other tightly gripping their worn handbag. "Mom!" Jordan ran over to her, his small body serving as a support. They came to talk to you. I'm sorry, she stammered, her face red with embarrassment, trying uselessly to smooth out her stained uniform. If I'd known we'd be visiting. Mrs. Thompson stood up carefully, her own pregnancy evident under the expensive dress. Please don't worry. We apologize for coming unannounced. She approached, extending her hand kindly. I'm Sarah Thompson, and this is my husband, James. We're sorry to interrupt your rest, Mr. Thompson added, noticing the obvious tiredness on her face. But your son Jordan did something extraordinary yesterday. The mother cast a worried glance at Jordan, who lowered his eyes to his own worn-out shoes. I met your son on the bus yesterday, Mrs. Thompson began, her soft voice laden with emotion. I was exhausted, barely able to balance myself when he offered his seat. But that wasn't all. She paused, her eyes watering. It was the way he talked about you, about your strength, about how you work 2 jobs even when you're pregnant. Your son told me how you work all day cleaning and then you go to the cafeteria, Mrs. Thompson continued, her voice breaking. Jordan's mother sank slowly into a chair, her tired legs giving way under the weight of the words. How you continue to work even with a high-risk pregnancy because you have no choice. Jordan nervously watched his mother, who alternated glances between him and the elegant couple. A silent tear ran down her cheek when Mrs. Thompson mentioned how her son had spoken of her with such pride and concern. Jordan was always like that, his mother whispered, reaching out to take her son's hand. Taking care of me more than I should allow. Her voice trembled, her voice shook. Sometimes I forget that he's just a child. Mr. Thompson sniffled, settling back on the sofa. Sarah was very touched by your story. She couldn't sleep at night, thinking about how a pregnant woman is being forced to work 2 jobs. He paused, his gaze becoming more determined. I own a building management company. We manage several commercial buildings here in Chicago, and he opened his leather briefcase, pulling out some papers. We have an opening in the administrative sector, office work, in an air-conditioned environment with full health insurance. His eyes met those of Jordan's mother. And the salary is 3 times what you make in both jobs combined. The work is from 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, Mr. Thompson explained, placing the documents on the table. Full health insurance that covers prenatal care, childbirth, and all the care you and the baby need. Food vouchers, transportation vouchers. He went on to list benefits that sounded like impossible dreams for the family. Jordan's mother clasped her hands in her lap, trying to contain her trembling. Her eyes skimmed over the papers on the table, employment contract, job description, health insurance documents. The monthly salary printed on the paper was more money than she could scrape together in 3 months of double-duty work. I have no experience with computers, she mumbled, her voice small. I only finished high school. We offer full training, Mrs. Thompson intervened gently. James always says that technical skills can be taught. Character and dedication are what really matter. Jordan's mother took a deep breath, one hand unconsciously stroking her belly. Her eyes met her son's, seeking in him the strength she always found. It was a decision that would change both their lives. No, all 3 of them. Jordan noticed the silent questioning in her gaze, the mixture of hope and fear at what seemed too good to be true. Jordan recognized that look, the same one his mother used to give him when they had to make difficult decisions together. He straightened his shoulders, trying to look stronger than he felt. Deep down, he wanted to shout, yes, but he knew that his mother needed more than that. She needed his trust, his security. He approached her slowly, taking her calloused hand in his. He felt the slight tremor in her fingers, saw the deep dark circles under her tired eyes. He thought of all the nights he'd heard her cry quietly, all the days he'd seen her leave for work, barely able to stand. "Mom," he whispered, his voice firmer than he expected. "You always taught me that God works in mysterious ways." She squeezed his hand lightly, feeling the baby move in her belly. Maybe it's our turn to receive a blessing." Jordan's mother let out a restrained sob, pulling him into a tight hug. When she pulled away, her eyes glistened with unshed tears. She straightened up in her chair, still holding her son's hand, and looked at the Thompsons. "I accept," she said softly, then more forcefully. "I accept the job, and I promise you won't regret trusting me." Jordan was helping his mother button up her new blouse, one of the sets Mrs. Thompson had insisted on lending him until his first paycheck. The soft fabric was so different from the rough uniform she used to wear. In the mirror, her mother looked like someone else, younger perhaps, without the weight of extreme fatigue on her shoulders. "I still can't believe it," she murmured, running her hands over her belly covered in the thin fabric. "It's like a dream." The baby moved, as if in response, making her smile. It was a different smile now, without the constant fear that had accompanied it before. Jordan arranged the small breakfast table he had prepared, bread and butter and coffee with milk, a luxury they could now afford. He watched his mother eat slowly, savoring every bite, without the desperate rush of previous mornings. "Are you sure you'll be all right on your own?" she asked for the third time, fixing her new bag on her shoulder, another gift from the Thompsons. "I can call you at lunchtime." "Mom," Jordan smiled, picking up the keys to hand them to her. "You'll be working in an office now, with air conditioning, and you'll be back before dark." Her voice shook a little at the end, still processing the change. She hugged him tightly, and Jordan smelled the soft perfume Mrs. Thompson had given him, so different from the smell of frying that had previously permeated his clothes. "You changed our lives, son," she whispered in his ear. "Your kind heart saved us." When she walked out of the door, she wasn't staggering with fatigue. Her steps were firm, her head held high. Jordan watched from the window as she walked to the bus stop, one hand lovingly on her belly, carrying no longer the weight of despair, but the promise of a better future. Jordan could barely concentrate in class. His eyes kept returning to the clock on the wall, imagining his mother in her new job. What would the office be like? Would the other employees be kind to her? Would the chair be comfortable for a pregnant woman? Every minute seemed to drag by. In math class, she found herself smiling as she solved equations, no more saving her lunch money to help with the math. At break, his classmates noticed something different about him and asked why he was so distracted. But how could he explain that his life had changed completely in just a few days? The drive home never seemed so long. He ran up the stairs, his heart pounding. When he opened the apartment door, he stopped in surprise. His mother was sitting on the sofa, still in her work clothes, a genuine smile lighting up her tired but happy face. "Jordan!" She stood up excitedly, her hands gesturing as she spoke. "Son, you won't believe it. I have my own desk with a new computer, and at lunchtime there's a restroom with a sofa. Sofa, son." She laughed, a sound Jordan hadn't heard for so long that his chest tightened with emotion. "And the baby." She stroked her belly. He was so calm today. I think even he felt the difference. Jordan watched his mother talking about the day, her eyes shining with excitement. It wasn't just the new job or the nice clothes. It was his mother being herself again, free from the crushing weight of daily survival. "Mr. Thompson introduced me to the whole team," she said, still on her feet, as if she couldn't contain her energy. "Everyone was so kind. Alice, who sits at the next table, even lent me a back support when she saw I was adjusting my chair. It's been so long since I've felt respected like this." Jordan sat down next to her on the sofa, observing how she moved differently, her shoulders more relaxed, her chin held high. There was no longer that expression of constant defeat on her face. "And at lunchtime, son," she continued, her eyes twinkling, "there's a pantry with fresh coffee and cold filtered water. No one looked at me funny for having to go to the bathroom several times. Mrs. Thompson has even set aside a small room that I can use to rest if I need to." She opened her new bag, rummaging through it until she found a small plastic card. Her hands trembled slightly as she held it out to Jordan. "Look, our health insurance. It's valid now." Silent tears streamed down her face. "Tomorrow, I'm going to make an appointment with the obstetrician Mrs. Thompson recommended. I won't have to wait for hours at the health center anymore." Jordan held the card as if it was something precious. On it, his and his mother's names printed in silver letters. It wasn't just a piece of plastic. It was the promise of security they'd never had. Jordan sat nervously in the waiting room of the private clinic, so different from the crowded health center they used to frequent. No peeling walls or broken chairs. Here, everything was clean and organized. His mother was leafing through a magazine, dressed in comfortable clothes, without having to ask for time off work or lie to her bosses. "Mrs. Oliveira," the nurse called out with a gentle smile. The doctor's room was spacious and welcoming, with a modern ultrasound monitor next to the gurney. Jordan watched intently as the doctor examined his mother, asking detailed questions about the pregnancy, checking the pressure several times until he was sure it was stable. "Now that you're in a more suitable working environment, your pressure has already started to normalize," the doctor explained, preparing the gel for the ultrasound. "Proper rest is making all the difference." Jordan held his mother's hand as the image appeared on the screen. The doctor moved the device slowly, patiently, explaining every detail. "And here," he smiled, adjusting the angle, "we can see clearly. It's a boy." Tears streamed down his mother's face as she squeezed Jordan's hand. "Another little man to look after me," she whispered, her voice tinged with emotion. Jordan stared mesmerized at the screen, where his baby brother was wriggling around, safe and healthy. For the first time since learning of her pregnancy, she didn't feel afraid of the future. Jordan held the scans and the first ultrasound photo as they walked down the street, his mother lighter, almost floating. "I'm going to need a strong name for him," she smiled, stroking her belly. "A name that matches his big brother, who is already my hero." Jordan's face warmed at the compliment. It was strange to think that now they could make real plans, not just dream about the impossible. "We can organize his little corner in the bedroom," he suggested, his voice animated. "Now that you don't have to work in the cafeteria anymore, you'll have time to rest and prepare everything." "And you can be just a big brother," she slung her arm around his shoulders, "no longer the man of the house. You can go back to being a child, my love." Passing a department store, they stopped instinctively in front of a window decorated with baby items. A white cradle was set up in the center, surrounded by teddy bears and colorful mobiles. Jordan noticed his mother discreetly looking at the price. Something that would once have been impossible now seemed achievable. "Look at that little blue jumpsuit," she pointed, her eyes sparkling. "With stars." Her voice shook a little. "It's the first time I can actually think about buying something new for the baby, not just accepting donations." Jordan watched his and his mother's reflection in the glass of the shop window, superimposed on the baby clothes and the white cradle. It seemed like another world, one where his mother could smile without worry, where they could stop to look at shop windows without the crushing weight of impossibility. All because he offered his seat on the bus. "We could have a look at the prices," his mother suggested shyly, as if she still didn't believe she could do it. "Just to give you an idea." She held the ultrasound in one hand, the other resting on the belly where her baby brother was growing. Inside the store, the air conditioning and the smell of new clothes created a welcoming atmosphere. Jordan watched his mother gently touch a soft blanket, checking the label carefully. It was no longer the desperate gesture of someone who can't afford to buy. It was the conscious choice of someone planning for the future. The light blue would go with, his mother began, but was interrupted by a familiar voice. Maria? Jordan? Mrs. Thompson was standing in the aisle of the store, her own belly even more prominent under a flowery dress. She was smiling, holding some baby clothes in her arms. What a wonderful coincidence. I've come shopping for the baby too. The two women approached each other naturally, like old friends, their 7-month-old bellies almost touching as they admired the baby clothes. Jordan watched fascinated as his mother, still wearing Mrs. Thompson's borrowed outfit, chatted with ease about diapers and bottles. Is it a boy too? His mother asked, showing him the newly done ultrasound. Mrs. Thompson smiled radiantly, reaching into her bag for a similar photo. Yes, we found out last week. She compared the two images, her hands touching over the counter. Look at them. They seem to be in the same position. They must have been born a few days apart. Jordan noticed how the differences that had once seemed so glaring, the expensive clothes, the jewelry, the refined perfume, now seemed to fade away. There they were, just two mothers sharing the joy and worries of pregnancy. Maria, Mrs. Thompson held her mother's hands gently. I'm organizing my baby shower for next month. What do you think of doing it together? A double shower to celebrate our boys who are already destined to be friends. Her mother's eyes watered. Sarah, I don't know if... I won't take no for an answer. Mrs. Thompson smiled, determined. After all, if it hadn't been for your amazing son, we might never have met. Our babies deserve to start their lives celebrating this friendship, don't you think? Jordan adjusted the bow tie that Mr. Thompson had insisted on giving him, looking around the room decorated in soft shades of blue. His mother, wearing a new dress for the first time in her life, was chatting animatedly with a group of women. Some were executives' wives, others office workers. They all treated her as an equal. In the center of the room, 2 decorated chairs awaited the mothers-to-be. The gift table overflowed with items for the 2 babies, with no distinction between which gift was for which family. Mrs. Thompson had made sure that everything was shared equally. Her mother laughed at something someone had said, one hand resting on her prominent belly. Jordan had never seen her so relaxed, so part of something. There was no longer that constant tension in her shoulders, that look of permanent worry. There, she was just another happy mother celebrating the arrival of her baby. So, you're the famous Jordan? An elegant lady approached him, holding a glass of juice. Sarah told us about the young gentleman who changed her life on the bus, but no one ever explained exactly how it happened. She looked at him with genuine curiosity. Jordan felt his face heat up, all the memories of that day coming back in a flash. The crowded bus, the tiredness in his legs, Mrs. Thompson trying to balance herself. Jordan took a deep breath, looking down at his hands as he organized his thoughts. It was a normal day, he began, his voice soft but firm. I was coming home from school, tired as usual. The bus was full and I'd managed to get a seat. More people came forward to listen, including some of his mother's work colleagues. When Mrs. Thompson got on, she could barely balance. She was pregnant, like my mother. His voice shook a little. I just thought about how my mother suffered on the crowded buses, how no one offered her a seat. Jordan looked up, meeting Mrs. Thompson's proud gaze from across the room. It was no big deal. I just offered my seat. But she... He smiled slightly. She started asking questions, and something in her gaze, it seemed like she really cared. When I told her about my mother, about the 2 jobs, about the pregnancy, Jordan felt a lump in his throat. Mrs. Thompson didn't just listen. She did something about it. He felt his mother's familiar touch on his shoulder. She had approached silently as he spoke, her eyes shining with restrained tears. "My son," she whispered, pulling him into a tight hug. "You didn't just offer a seat on the bus. You made room for a miracle in our lives." Jordan came home from school to find his mother different every day, stronger, more confident, more herself. The office had become a place where she could grow professionally. Her colleagues respected her, her ideas were listened to. At antenatal appointments, the doctors always smiled when they saw her tests, her blood pressure finally under control, her baby growing healthily. Nights were no longer lonely. His mother came home at the usual time, still with the energy to help him with his homework or to talk about her day. The small apartment, once a silent witness to so much fatigue, now echoed with plans and laughter. In the room they would be sharing, Jordan was helping to assemble the crib they had bought in small installments, the same one they had admired in the shop window. His mother carefully folded the baby's new clothes, some gifts from the baby shower, others bought with her own salary. The smell of fresh paint filled the air. They had painted a wall light blue, a color they had chosen together on a Saturday afternoon. "Look at this," her mother smiled, holding up a small pair of overalls. "Your little brother will have his own clothes, his own bed." She paused, stroking her belly. "And most importantly, he'll have a present mother and an amazing big brother." Jordan was organizing the baby's hygiene products on a makeshift shelf he had made at school during his carpentry classes. Each item there represented not just a need that had been met, but his family's regained dignity. Neighbors who had previously only commented on her difficulties now came up with small offers of help. Mrs. Maria from 302 knitted a blue blanket with stars. "To match the wall," she said. Mr. Jose on the first floor, who was a retired carpenter, helped Jordan reinforce the crib and build a small chest of drawers. His mother's work colleagues also got involved. Alice from the next desk showed up one Saturday with curtains that her husband, who was a seamstress, had made especially for the baby's room. The finance department staff got together to buy a musical mobile that played soft lullabies. "I never thought so many people would care," his mother whispered one evening as they organized the loving donations. Jordan observed how each gift had a story, a face, a gesture of affection behind it. On the blue wall, now decorated with cloud stickers, Mr. Thompson had personally installed a secure shelf for the baby's belongings. Mrs. Thompson often showed up with bags of diapers or clothes that she had accidentally bought too many of. When they had finally finished tidying up, mother and son stood in the doorway of the small transformed bedroom. The white cradle leaned against the wall, the knitted blanket carefully folded, the mobile spinning gently in the breeze coming through the window with its new curtains. It wasn't just a space for the baby. It was a testament to how a community could come together to look after its own. Jordan arranged the teddy bears in the crib for the third time, wanting everything to be perfect. He picked up the picture frame he had made at school, an ultrasound photo decorated with blue stars, and moved it to another position on the shelf. Now that the room was ready, the reality that he was going to be a big brother seemed closer than ever. In the kitchen, his mother was quietly preparing dinner, a common scene now that she was home from work at a normal time. The smell of home-cooked food filled the apartment, so different from the rushed snacks of yesteryear. Jordan smiled as he heard her humming softly, one hand constantly caressing her enormous belly. "Son?" Her voice sounded different, tense. "Jordan?" He ran into the kitchen and found his mother leaning over the sink, breathing heavily. A puddle of water was forming at her feet. "I think your brother's decided it's time," she tried to smile, but a contraction made her squeeze her eyes shut in pain. Take the suitcase we packed and call Mrs. Thompson? Jordan felt her heart race. Her hands were shaking as she reached for her cell phone and the bag they had prepared weeks before. It was real. His little brother was coming. Jordan walked nervously through the waiting room of the private hospital, so different from the public emergency rooms he knew. Mrs. Thompson, who had insisted on coming even though she was so close to her own birth, held his hand occasionally, offering words of comfort. Mr. Thompson had left an important mid-afternoon meeting to be there. "Your mother is strong, Jordan." Mrs. Thompson smiled, settling uncomfortably in the chair, her own enormous belly reminding her that in a few weeks it would be her turn. "And she has the best medical team looking after her."